The diplomatic arrangement. The Federation Council chamber fell silent as Captain Elias Parker stood at attention, his military posture betraying none of the anxiety churning inside him. Through the massive viewports of orbital station Artemis, Earth gleamed blue and serene, unaware that its fate was being decided in this sterile room. "Captain Parker," began Admiral Jansen, her weathered face grim beneath silver-streaked hair, "you understand the gravity of our situation." "Yes, Admiral," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "The Vespian fleet has been detected at the edge of our solar system. Without Galactic Alliance protection, Earth stands alone." The holographic display at the center of the room showed the approaching armada, hundreds of warships with destructive capability beyond Earth's defenses. Earth had only recently achieved interstellar travel, a latecomer to the complex political landscape of the galaxy. Their technology, while impressive for their development timeline, was woefully inadequate against established powers. "What the Admiral is dancing around," interjected Counselor Ortiz, "is that we've received an offer of alliance that could save billions of lives." He slid a data tablet across the polished table. "The Zinthari Empire has offered full military protection. Their defense grid is the only thing the Vespians respect." Elias studied the document, eyes widening as he reached the terms. "This is a marriage arrangement." "A diplomatic union," corrected Ambassador Joe, her expression carefully neutral. "The Zinthari royal family has requested an Earth representative for their youngest princess. You've been selected due to your exemplary diplomatic record and unmarried status." "I'm to marry someone I've never met to secure an alliance?" Elias struggled to keep his tone professional. At 35, he dedicated his life to Earth's diplomatic corps, specializing in first-contact scenarios. Romance had always taken a back seat to duty, but this was beyond anything he'd anticipated. "Their cultural attaché was quite specific," continued Joe. "The Zinthari practice marriage alliances to cement diplomatic bonds. It's considered the highest form of treaty." Admiral Jansen stood, her uniform impeccably pressed. "Captain, I won't order you to do this, but without Zinthari protection, our projections give Earth less than 3 months before the Vespians arrive. 3 billion lives against one man's future. The math was simple, even if the emotions weren't." "I'll do it," Elias said finally, "for Earth." The relief in the room was palpable. Only Ambassador Joe's expression remained troubled. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The Zinthari were insistent that you not see the princess before the ceremony, and when pressed about her, they became evasive." "What aren't they telling us?" Elias asked. "We don't know," Jansen admitted, "but they're our only hope." 2 weeks later, Elias found himself aboard the Celestial Envoy, a sleek diplomatic vessel speeding toward Zinthar Prime. The ship's observation deck offered spectacular views of the cosmos, but Elias barely noticed, focused instead on the data screens displaying Zinthari cultural information. "The physical preparation regimen must be followed precisely," instructed diplomat Nara Kwan, his cultural liaison. She was a veteran of alien diplomacy with an impressive record of successful negotiations. 3 hours daily in the gravity chamber," Elias noted, scanning the list. "Zinthari gravity is 1.3 times Earth standard, and these dietary supplements to help your system adjust to Zinthari atmospheric composition," Nara explained. "Their oxygen levels are similar to Earth's, but certain trace gases differ. Nothing harmful, but adaptation will make your transition smoother." Elias nodded, moving to the next section. "What about the princess? There must be something about her in our files." Nara's expression tightened. "That's where things get complicated. Princess Vaiksara is rarely seen in public. The Zinthari royal family keeps her somewhat isolated." "Is she ill, disabled in some way?" Elias pressed. "The Zinthari consider it deeply offensive to discuss a royal family member's attributes before formal introduction," Nara replied diplomatically. "But our intelligence suggests she's considered. Unusual by Zinthari standards." "Unusual how?" Nara hesitated. Captain, Xanthari physiology is already quite different from human. They're silicon-based life forms with crystalline physiological components. They communicate partly through bioluminescence. Their concept of appearance differs fundamentally from ours. Elias rubbed his temples. So I'm marrying someone who might look completely alien to human sensibilities, and that's the best-case scenario. The diplomatic corps considered other candidates, Nara admitted. But your psychological profile showed exceptional adaptability to non-human cultures. Your work with the Arcturian delegation proved you can form positive relationships with beings very different from yourself. The Arcturians look like giant squids, Elias pointed out. I wasn't marrying one. One person's discomfort against billions of lives, Nara said quietly. I'm sorry, Captain. As the journey continued, Elias immersed himself in Xanthari culture. Their society was ancient, over 12,000 Earth years of recorded history. They valued harmony and symmetry in all things. Their cities were architectural marvels of crystalline structures that responded to the emotional states of inhabitants. Most intriguing were their family structures. Xanthari formed complex bonding networks rather than simple pairs, yet the royal family maintained more traditional arrangements to simplify dynastic lines. Marriage ceremonies were elaborate affairs lasting 7 days, involving ritual exchanges of energy and the creation of permanent psychic bonds. Will I be expected to form a psychic bond? Elias asked during one of their daily briefings. The process has been modified for you, Nara explained. The Xanthari understand human limitations. You'll undergo a simplified ceremony. Thoughtful of them, Elias muttered. As they approached Xanthar Prime, the ship's communications officer delivered a message. Captain Parker, we've received a transmission from the Royal Palace. It's encrypted for your eyes only. In his quarters, Elias activated the secure channel. A hooded figure appeared, features obscured within the shadow of an ornate cowl. When it spoke, the translation software rendered a feminine voice with musical undertones. Earth Captain, came the carefully measured words. I am Vaiksara. I understand your apprehension. Elias straightened. Princess, I'm honored by your communication. A soft sound emerged from the hood, possibly laughter. No need for pretense. You journey to bind yourself to an unknown being for your world's protection. I recognize the sacrifice. What should I know before we meet? Elias asked directly. There was a pause. My appearance causes discomfort among my kind. I was concerned your people might withdraw if they saw me before arrangements were finalized. Elias leaned toward the screen. Princess, humans have a saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Our standards may differ entirely from your people's. A fascinating concept, she replied. Perhaps there is wisdom in your species after all. The hooded figure shifted slightly. I must go, the royal attendants approach, until our meeting, Earth Captain. The transmission ended, leaving Elias with more questions than answers. But for the first time since accepting this mission, he felt a flicker of curiosity rather than dread. The Xanthari royal transport arrived the following day, a massive crystalline vessel that dwarfed the celestial envoy. As Elias prepared to board with his small diplomatic team, Nara delivered final instructions. Remember, no direct questions about the princess's appearance. Follow the ceremonial protocols exactly. The alliance depends on this union being recognized as legitimate by Xanthari custom. Elias nodded, straightening his formal uniform. Earth's future rested on his shoulders, and on his ability to bond with a bride he couldn't imagine. For Earth, he whispered to himself as the airlock cycled open. The Xanthari delegation waited beyond, tall, willowy beings with translucent skin that pulsed with internal light patterns. Their eyes, 3 per face, blinked in synchronized patterns as they assessed the humans. Welcome, Earth Bonded, announced the foremost Xanthari, its skin flashing in formal patterns. I am Royal Minister Kelthar. You journey to a union that will reshape galaxy history. Elias bowed precisely as instructed. We come with gratitude and respect. As the Earth delegation boarded the Xanthari vessel, Elias noted how the royal attendants exchanged subtle light patterns when they thought he wasn't looking. Their translator was inactive, but body language transcended species. They were nervous. About him, about this arrangement, about something. About the princess he was traveling to marry. The revelation. The Zinthari royal transport glided through the crystalline docking bay of the palace, its engines emitting a melodic hum rather than the harsh rumble Elias was accustomed to. Through the viewport, Zinthar Prime revealed itself in breathtaking glory, vast cities of living crystal that caught the light of twin suns, refracting it into prismatic displays across the horizon. Floating islands drifted through the amber sky, connected by bridges of pure energy that pulsed with traffic. Magnificent, breathed Nara beside him, momentarily dropping her professional detachment. Royal Minister Kelthar's skin flickered with pleased patterns. The central harmony has stood for 10,000 cycles. You are among the first humans to witness it. As they disembarked, Elias noticed something peculiar. While the main palace complex bustled with activity, one crystalline tower stood apart, darker, more angular, connected to the main structure by a single slender bridge. When he glanced at it, the Zinthari escort subtly shifted position, as if to block his view. "Your preparation chambers," announced Kelthar, leading them into a wing of the palace where the crystals shimmered in welcoming blues and golds. "The bonding ceremony begins tomorrow at first light. Tonight, you will undergo the ritual purification." Elias was separated from the Earth delegation and led to private quarters that adjusted their lighting and temperature as he entered. The furnishings were alien, but somehow adapted to human physiology. The bed firm but not crystalline, the facilities recognizable if unusual. "The princess sends this," said a smaller Zinthari attendant, placing a translucent box on a hovering table. "A pre-bonding gift." When the attendant departed, Elias examined the box cautiously. Inside lay a simple medallion of iridescent material that seemed to shift colors as he turned it. A communication panel chimed softly. "Earth Captain," came Vaiksara's voice, though no image appeared. "The amulet contains translated records of my world's history. I thought you might appreciate context before tomorrow's events." "Thank you, Princess," Elias replied, holding the medallion. "May I ask a personal question?" "A pause, you may." "Are you entering this arrangement willingly?" He needed to know if she was as much a diplomatic pawn as he was. Another longer pause. "My choices have always been limited by what I am. But this union was my suggestion, not my family's. Does that surprise you?" "It did. Why would you choose a stranger from another world?" "Because you have no preconceptions of what a Zinthari should be," she answered simply. "I must prepare for the ceremony. Until tomorrow, Earth Captain." The connection ended. Elias placed the medallion against his temple as instructed by a small pictogram on the box. Immediately, his mind filled with flowing images, the history of Zinthar unfolding in immersive detail. He lost himself in the experience until a chime announced the arrival of the purification attendants. The ritual was less invasive than he'd feared, a series of baths in luminescent solutions, followed by meditation in a chamber that hummed with subtle energies. By the time he was dressed in the ceremonial attire, a flexible armor-like outfit of living crystal that adjusted to his form, dawn was approaching. "It is time," announced Chief Attendant Myrith, her skin pulsing with formal patterns. "The great harmonizing awaits." The ceremonial chamber took Elias' breath away. A vast dome of crystal opened to the sky, where the twin suns cast dual shadows across gathered dignitaries from a dozen worlds. In the center stood a raised platform encircled by pulsing rings of energy. The Zinthari royal family occupied one side of the chamber, their forms resplendent in ceremonial light patterns. Elias spotted the Earth delegation looking small and plain among the exotic assembly. A resonant tone echoed through the chamber, and all movement ceased. From one entrance, Elias was guided to the central platform. From the opposite side came a procession of Zinthari attendants surrounding a smaller figure completely shrouded in layers of shimmering veils. "Princess Vaiksara," The veiled figure moved with a strange, almost fluid grace that differed from the methodical movements of others in Thari. As they both reached the platform, Grand Harmonizer Zalthar, an ancient Zinthari whose crystalline features had grown elaborate with age, began the ceremony. Today, two beings choose harmony over discord, unity over separation. Today, worlds join through the sacred bonding. The Grand Harmonizer's voice resonated through the chamber without seeming to increase in volume. Earth Captain Elias Parker, do you come freely to this union? I do, Elias responded, the ritual words coming easily after days of practice. Princess Vaiksara of the Royal Harmonies, do you come freely to this union? From beneath the veils came a voice like wind through crystal chimes. I do. The ceremony proceeded with ritual exchanges. Elias presented Earth gifts, precious metals, works of art, and environmental samples. The Zinthari royal family offered crystalline knowledge cores and energy matrices that hummed with power. The bonding requires the joining of essences, explained the Grand Harmonizer. Earth Captain, you will place your hand upon the resonance crystal, and Princess Vaiksara will do the same. A servant brought forward a crystal that pulsed with inner light. Elias placed his hand on it as instructed. After a moment's hesitation, the veiled princess extended what appeared to be a hand, though with unusual proportions, toward the crystal. When both touched it simultaneously, the crystal flared brilliantly. Elias felt a strange, tingling sensation race up his arm and spread throughout his body. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembly. The resonance is harmonious, announced the Grand Harmonizer, genuine surprise in his voice. The universe acknowledges this union. Several Zinthari nobles exchanged light patterns that Elias couldn't interpret, but their body language suggested shock or confusion. Now comes the unveiling, intoned the Grand Harmonizer. As is tradition, the bonded pair first see one another in the sacred light of union. Elias' heart pounded. This was the moment of truth, the moment he would see the bride that had been kept so mysteriously hidden. Attendants approached Vaiksara, ceremonially removing layer after layer of veiling. As the final covering was lifted, a collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Several Zinthari turned away, their skin patterns flashing what Elias recognized as distress signals. Vaiksara stood revealed, and Elias could only stare. She was nothing like the others Zinthari. Where they were tall and slender, she was more compact. Where their crystalline bodies refracted light in orderly patterns, hers bent light in chaotic, swirling displays. Most strikingly, instead of the three symmetrical eyes of standard Zinthari, Vaiksara possessed 5 eyes arranged in an asymmetrical pattern across her face. They blinked independently, each a different shade of amber and gold. But what shocked Elias wasn't horror. It was the realization that by human standards, she was mesmerizing. Her form had a fluid grace, her light patterns creating displays more complex and beautiful than any he'd seen among the Zinthari. She was alien, certainly, but with a wild symmetry that drew the eye rather than repelled it. You're not what I expected, Elias said finally, aware of the silence that had fallen across the chamber. Vaiksara's body pulsed with patterns that his cultural training identified as anxiety and resignation. You hide your disgust admirably, better than most. Disgust, Elias shook his head, genuine confusion in his voice. I'm not disgusted, I'm fascinated. Her light patterns shifted to what he recognized as the Zinthari equivalent of disbelief. Impossible. I think, Elias said carefully, conscious of their audience, humans and Zinthari must perceive beauty very differently. The Grand Harmonizer cleared his throat, or made the Zinthari equivalent of that sound. The unveiling is complete. The universe has witnessed. Let the bonded pair now complete the ceremony with the dance of integration. Musical tones filled the chamber as Elias and Vaiksara were directed to move within the concentric energy rings. The dance was more symbolic than actual, a series of synchronized movements that brought them closer together with each circuit of the platform. As they moved, Elias whispered, "Your people consider you unattractive." "I am a disharmony," she replied softly. My patterns do not follow the established rhythms. My form does not reflect proper proportions. I have been hidden away most of my life. On Earth, uniqueness is often celebrated, Elias told her. What makes you different might be exactly what makes you beautiful to human eyes. Her light patterns flickered in complex sequences. Truly. Truly. As they completed the final circuit, their hands met in the center of the platform. The energy rings pulsed brilliantly, then converged in a spiral that enveloped them both. Elias felt a strange connection form, not the full psychic bond of Zinthari tradition, but something subtler, a sense of Vaiksara's presence in his mind. The bonding is complete, announced the Grand Harmonizer. Two worlds, two beings, now joined in cosmic harmony. The assembled dignitaries applauded in their various cultural ways, some with sounds, others with light displays or gravitational pulses. But Elias noticed how the Zinthari nobility maintained a careful distance from Vaiksara, even as they offered formal congratulations. The Earth delegation approached, Ambassador Joe leading them. "Congratulations, Captain," she said formally, then added in a lower voice, "The treaty is being finalized as we speak. Earth is now under Zinthari protection." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of billions of lives lift slightly from his shoulders. He had fulfilled his mission. Earth was safe. But as he glanced at Vaiksara, who stood slightly apart even during their own celebration, he realized a new mission was just beginning. This was no longer simply about diplomatic necessity. It was about two beings from different worlds trying to build something meaningful from an arranged beginning. As tradition dictated, they were eventually led to the royal chambers, not in the main palace complex, Elias noted, but in that separate, darker tower he had observed earlier. The chambers were spacious but isolated, with few attendants and no other residents in the tower. When the doors closed behind them, leaving them alone for the first time, an awkward silence fell. "So," Elias said finally, removing the ceremonial outer layer of his attire, "I suppose we should get to know each other now that we're married." Vaiksara moved to a wall that immediately formed into a reflective surface, a mirror. She gestured for Elias to stand beside her. "Look at us together. See how wrong my patterns are? How my energy signature disrupts rather than harmonizes? My extra eyes, my irregular crystalline structure." Elias looked at their reflection, one human, one alien, vastly different yet standing together. "I see two very different beings," he said carefully, "but I don't see anything wrong with either of them." "My family has kept me isolated since my emergence," Vaiksara said softly, her light patterns dimming. "Others in Thari find my presence disturbing. My patterns interfere with their harmonic balance." "Is that why you suggested this arrangement? To escape isolation?" Her 5 eyes blinked in sequence. "Partly, but also because I see things others cannot. Patterns in space, fluctuations in energy fields, signals that others miss." She turned from the mirror to face him directly. "The Vespian threat to your world, I detected it before our official sensors could confirm it. I knew your people would need protection." "You saw a mutual benefit," Elias realized. "Protection for Earth and for you." "A purpose," she finished, "and perhaps understanding." Elias considered the strange, fascinating being before him and the mysteries her differences might hold. "I think," he said slowly, "this arrangement might benefit us both in ways neither of our governments anticipated." For the first time, Vaiksara's light patterns shifted to what his training identified as cautious hope. "Tell me, Earth Captain Elias, now that you've seen the disharmonious princess, do you regret your sacrifice?" Elias smiled. "I'm beginning to think it might not be such a sacrifice after all." Unexpected bond. The first week of their union passed in a careful dance of cultural exchange and cautious discovery. Elias learned that Zinthari did not sleep as humans did, instead entering periodic crystalline stasis, where their bodies would become more rigid and translucent, their light patterns slowing to a gentle pulse. Vaiksara, fascinated by human sleep, would sometimes watch him drift off, her 5 eyes blinking in asynchronous patterns that he was beginning to find comforting rather than alien. "Your consciousness simply departs," she asked one morning as Elias woke to find her studying him. Yet your body continues functioning. Not departs exactly, Elias explained, stretching. More like shifts to a different state. We process memories, heal, dream. Dreams, Vaiksara repeated, the word seeming to fascinate her. We have nothing comparable. During stasis, we are dormant. Their chambers in the isolated tower became a sanctuary of sorts. Outside its walls, the discomfort of the court was palpable. When they attended formal functions, Zinthari nobles maintained a careful distance from Vaiksara, their light patterns shifting to muted tones when forced to interact with her. Elias noticed how she would dim her own patterns in response, trying to be less disruptive to their sensibilities. You shouldn't have to diminish yourself, he told her after a particularly uncomfortable state dinner where several nobles had requested seating reassignments to move farther from them. It is what I have always done, she replied, her voice tinged with resignation. On the 10th day of their union, Vaiksara led Elias to a hidden chamber deep within their tower. There is something I wish to show you, she said, her patterns flickering with what he now recognized as nervous anticipation. The chamber was spherical, its walls lined with crystalline formations unlike any he'd seen in the palace. This is a perception chamber, she explained. Most Zinthari use them to achieve perfect harmonic alignment with our planet's energy field. But you use it differently, Elias guessed. Vaiksara's light patterns intensified. Yes, where others seek harmony, I find broader awareness. She approached the center of the chamber, gesturing for him to join her. I cannot form a complete psychic bond with you as Zinthari can with each other, but I can share what I perceive. As they stood together, the chamber responded to her presence. The crystalline walls began to shimmer, then turned transparent, revealing what at first appeared to be stars, but unlike any star field Elias had ever seen. Patterns of light and energy flowed and swirled around them, some passing through their bodies as if they were ghosts. What am I seeing? He whispered, awed by the spectacle. Energy currents, Vaiksara explained, her voice taking on a resonant quality. The flows that connect all things. Most Zinthari perceive only the local patterns, those that make up our immediate environment. I see. Further. The display shifted, focusing now on a specific stream of energy that pulsed with an ominous red hue. The Vespian fleet, she said. See how their energy signature disrupts the natural flow? Their technology bends space in ways that damage the underlying fabric. Elias stared at the visualization. You can track them from here. I can perceive them, she corrected. But more importantly, I can see what they cannot. The display shifted again, revealing complex nodal points where energy streams intersected. These junction points, if properly activated, can create defensive barriers far more effective than conventional shields. Understanding dawned. This is why the Zinthari defenses are so formidable. You've shown them these patterns. Vaiksara's light dimmed slightly. To a limited extent, my disharmony makes my insights suspect in their eyes. They use only what they can verify through conventional means. That's why you proposed the alliance with Earth, Elias realized. Not just for protection or escape, but because you needed someone who would listen. Your species has no preconceptions about how energy should flow, she confirmed. You might see value where my people see only chaos. The implications were staggering. If what Vaiksara perceived was accurate, she wasn't merely unusual by Zinthari standards. She was a strategic asset of incalculable value. A being who could perceive the fundamental energies of the universe in ways others couldn't. Later that evening, as they shared a meal in their chambers, Elias received an urgent communication from Nara. Captain, we have a situation. The Zinthari Defense Council is convening an emergency session. Ambassador Joe requests your presence. In the council chamber, holographic displays showed the Vespian fleet had altered course. No longer headed toward Earth, but now on a direct trajectory toward Zinthar Prime. They detected our defensive preparations for Earth and recognized our interference, explained High Commander Zelvac, his crystalline form glinting with militant light patterns. Now they turn their aggression toward us. We should never have involved ourselves with their primitive world, muttered Counselor Dureth, with a dismissive gesture toward the Earth delegation. Ambassador Joe's expression remained diplomatic, but Elias could see the strain. Perhaps this is an opportunity for our new alliance to demonstrate its value, she suggested carefully. What defenses are being mobilized? Elias asked, studying the tactical displays. Standard energy shields and disruptor arrays, High Commander Zelvac replied. Our standard protocols have repelled Vespian aggression before. Elias glanced at Vixara, who stood silently at the edge of the council chamber, her light patterns subdued as always in public. And what about alternative defensive measures? Are there unconventional options being considered? A ripple of light patterns, the Zinthari equivalent of uncomfortable murmurs, passed through the council. We utilize proven methodologies, Counselor Dureth said stiffly. Experimental approaches risk catastrophic failure. The meeting continued, but it was clear the Zinthari had no interest in exploring alternative strategies, particularly any that might originate from their disharmonious princess. After the council adjourned, Elias found Vixara waiting in a quiet corridor. They won't listen, she said simply, her patterns showing resignation but not surprise. Then we'll make them listen, Elias replied. Show me again what you showed me in the perception chamber, but this time we'll record it and translate it into formats their conventional sensors can verify. Over the next 3 days, while the Zinthari Defense Council prepared their traditional responses to the approaching threat, Elias, Vixara, and a small team from the Earth delegation worked tirelessly. Using Earth's more adaptable, if less advanced, technology, they created translation algorithms that could convert Vixara's perceptions into data formats compatible with Zinthari defense systems. If we can't convince them with theory, we'll convince them with results, Elias said as they finalized their preparations. When the Vespian fleet entered the outer reaches of the Zinthari system, High Commander Zelvac ordered the activation of the planetary defense grid. Massive energy shields shimmered into existence around major population centers, and disruptor arrays powered up at strategic locations. Elias and Vixara, watching from the Defense Command Center, exchanged glances. The standard defenses would slow the Vespians, but according to Vixara's perceptions, they had adapted their approach specifically to counter known Zinthari technology. Your Eminence, Elias addressed King Thalzer, who had arrived to oversee the defense. I respectfully request permission to implement a supplementary defensive measure. The king's light patterns showed skepticism. This is hardly the time for experimentation, Earth Captain. Father, Vixara spoke up, her voice stronger than Elias had ever heard it in public. What he proposes comes from my perceptions. The Vespians have adapted to our standard defenses. They will breach them within hours. King Thalzer's patterns flickered with discomfort, both at being addressed by his daughter in public and at the content of her warning. Before he could respond, the monitoring systems flashed urgent alerts. Vespian energy weapons charging, reported a defense technician. Configuration unknown, our shields cannot identify the pattern. The first barrage struck, and the outer defensive layers shimmered ominously. Shield integrity at 72% and declining rapidly, called another technician. Unknown energy type is disrupting the harmonic stabilizers. The king's patterns shifted to alarm. How did they develop countermeasures so quickly? They perceive patterns too, Vixara said quietly, just differently than most Zinthari. She approached the central command console. Father, please let me help. A tense moment passed as another barrage struck, dropping shields to 63%. Finally, the king gave a gesture of assent. Proceed, we have little to lose. Elias quickly interfaced their translation system with the main defense grid. Vixara placed her hands on a crystalline receptor, her body beginning to pulse with intense patterns of light that caused several nearby Zinthari to step back in discomfort. On the main display, new energy configurations began to form, shield harmonics shifting to patterns that made no sense to conventional Zinthari science, but aligned perfectly with what Vixara had shown Elias in the perception chamber. As the next Vespian barrage hit, the shields rippled but held steady. Shield integrity stabilizing at 61%, reported the technician, confusion evident in his patterns. The disruptive energy is being channeled somehow. Not just channeled, Vixara explained, her voice strained with concentration. Redirected, their energy signature contains harmonic vulnerabilities of its own. The defensive shields began to pulse with complex patterns, no longer simply absorbing the Vespian attacks, but reshaping and returning the energy in modified forms. On the tactical displays, several Vespian ships suddenly went dark, their systems overwhelmed by the redirected energy. Remarkable, breathed High Commander Zelvak, his militant patterns giving way to something like wonder. They're retreating. Indeed, the Vespian fleet was breaking formation, withdrawing to a safe distance. Communication channels suddenly activated, the Vespians requesting immediate diplomatic contact. They wish to negotiate, King Thouser said, his patterns showing astonishment. We've never brought them to the negotiating table before. In the aftermath, as the Defense Council scrambled to analyze what had occurred, Elias found a moment alone with Vixara in a quiet alcove of the command center. You were magnificent, he told her. They can't ignore your abilities now. Her patterns showed a complex mix of emotions. Perhaps, or perhaps they will simply incorporate what I've shown them into their proven methodologies and continue as before. I won't let that happen, Elias promised. Our alliance is about more than protection, it's about growth, embracing new perspectives. Later that evening, they were summoned to a private audience with the king and queen. To Elias' surprise, the royal couple received them not in the formal throne room, but in their personal chambers, a space of remarkable beauty where living crystal formations grew in harmonious patterns. My daughter, King Thouser began, his patterns showing an emotion Elias hadn't seen directed at Vixara before, something like pride, tempered with regret. Today you saved countless lives. I only showed what I have always seen, Vixara replied softly. Perhaps that is our failure, said Queen Lyrissa, stepping forward. We saw your differences as disharmony when they were simply a different harmony. The Alliance Council wishes to appoint you as Joint Defense Coordinator, the king continued. Your unique perceptions, combined with Earth's adaptive technology approaches, create possibilities we never considered. Vixara's patterns flickered with surprise. You would give me an official role after all this time. If you will accept it, the queen said, we have much to atone for. As they left the royal chambers, Elias felt Vixara's hand slip into his, a gesture she had learned from him, one that still felt strange with her crystalline fingers but had become their private symbol of connection. What happens now? She asked as they walked through corridors where, for the first time, passing Zinthari acknowledged her with respectful gestures rather than averted gazes. Now, Elias said, we build something neither of our worlds expected, a true alliance based on understanding our differences, not despite them. In the following weeks, as diplomatic relations with the Vespians progressed and the Earth-Zinthari alliance formalized into a comprehensive treaty, Elias and Vixara found themselves at the center of a cultural transformation. Their union, begun as a diplomatic arrangement between strangers, had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. The isolated tower where they had been quartered was gradually incorporated back into the main palace complex, symbolic of Vixara's reintegration into Zinthari society. More importantly, a joint research institute was established where her perceptual abilities could be studied and applied for the benefit of both worlds. I never imagined acceptance, Vixara confessed one evening as they stood on the balcony of their chambers, watching the twin suns set over the crystalline landscape. At best, I hoped for purpose. And now, Elias asked, studying the complex patterns of light that played across her form, patterns he now found not just beautiful but beloved in their familiarity. Now I have both, she said, her 5 eyes focusing on him in sequence, and something else I never expected. What's that? Her patterns shifted to the configuration he had come to recognize as her equivalent of a smile. A partner who sees me, truly sees me, and finds harmony where others saw only discord. Elias took her hand, their fundamentally different biologies no longer a barrier, but a reminder of the bridge they had built between worlds. On Earth, we have a saying, sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the best destinations. As the final rays of the twin suns cast their light across the crystalline city, Elias reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. He had come to Zinthar Prime prepared to sacrifice his future for Earth's protection. Instead, he had found a new future, one richer and more meaningful than anything he could have imagined.